I'm an Armenian American activist, and when I was being brought up, I knew nothing about Armenian history, language, or culture. And my mother had put me in this Zionist Jewish neighborhood where I heard about the Holocaust every day, and I was the only non-Jewish person in my public school, and so I was discriminated against for being a Goya and experienced racism at a very early age. And then I went to UCLA, and in the library, I read this book and discovered the Armenian, at that time it was called Massacres. And I was so shocked. And I went home and I said to my mom, why didn't you tell me about this? And she said, because it was too sad. And then I transferred to Berkeley, and I was in the Armenian Students Association. And on April 24th, which is the National Day of Commemoration of the Armenian Genocide, because that's when they took the intellectuals and killed them. And we put up photos of the Armenian Genocide in the library, and the Turkish consulate called the library and said, these are lies, and the school that I paid tuition for took them down. And we were so angry, we put them in Sproul Plaza, and this guy walked up to me and said, why are you making up these photos? As if we would, if we could make up bones and fields, anything. So I took the photos, made 1,000 flyers, plastered them all over Berkeley, and started interviewing genocide survivors. I went to the churches and I said, is there anyone that that went through this that I can talk to, since there was no history book I could read? And so they put me in touch with these elderly people that were mainly women, and I started interviewing them. And then I became a part of I guess the leftist movement, and what was going on in Berkeley at that time was the people of color movement. And I realized that, when there was this rally on Iran, it was all white people talking about Iran. And my friend Anahid was from Iran, and we said, well, we're Near Eastern, Middle Eastern women, why can't we speak? And they wouldn't let us. So then I realized that I should join the people of color movement and say that Armenians are not European, we're not white, we're an ancient indigenous civilization, and that we should be a part of this movement. And even though we have light-skin privilege, light-skin people of color privilege is very different than white-skin privilege, because we do not have a secure place in false history. Our very heritage is being attacked by the white powers, and they kind of screwed us over and didn't help us. And so for 10 years that was a big struggle in my life, to get the people of color movements to accept Armenians. And finally I got them to accept Armenians as Near Eastern people of color, but there was no backup in the Armenian community, because a lot of Armenians wanted to be assimilated, they wanted to pass, their minds were colonialized. So it was a very hard struggle. So for decades and decades, being in leftist political movements, like here in New York, when there was Occupy Wall Street, I went there and I was wearing this t-shirt which says, Eastern Turkey is occupied Western Armenia. And this guy came up to me and he said, is this about Thanksgiving? And I was so shocked. I thought, oh my God, I have to have a table here at Occupied Wall Street on the Armenian freedom struggle. So I went to live at Occupied Wall Street. And it was wonderful, because in the years that I was doing, every year I do radio shows on Pacifica about the Armenian Genocide, and try to write to newspapers and get included, and it's very hard to get included because Armenia is not on the agenda. They don't care about all the issues, and so my entire involvement in the leftist movement was how to connect Armenia to what was going on. Like, for instance, here in New York, there's a lot of free Mamiya people. Like, Mamiya is this black activist political prisoner, and there's a lot of people who free Leonard Pielter, and he was a native in the AIM struggle. So Armenians have our political prisoner, Hampik Sasunian. So I made a sculpture with Mamiya's and Hampik's and Leonard's picture in the same place, and to try and bring some awareness. But it's very hard because Armenians themselves don't even want to be associated with our own political prisoner who's been in jail for 32 years because what happened is that after the Armenian Genocide, a lot of Armenians for 60 years were peacefully petitioning the United Nations for justice. No one cared. So at that time in the 70s, there were these movements, and we had the Armenian Secret Army and the Justice Commandos, and they were doing things to bring attention to the lack of justice in our struggle. And what happened is that just year after year, there was Turkish denial of everything, and in 1988, when there was the Armenian earthquake, since I'm an artist, and this says Hai Benig, which means indigenous Armenians. I thought, well, I'll go and help in the earthquake because, I'll do art therapy with kids and stuff. And I'd never been to my homeland, and it was very hard to even get a visa to go there. And when I finally got there, in the youth hostel, I met this guy, Monte Melkonian, who had been in the Armenian Students Association in Berkeley. And he said that there was a war going on in Artsakh, and I'd never heard of Artsakh. I'd never heard about a war. And I just want to show you that, okay, here's Armenia. And Armenia is an ancient country. They were the first Christian nation existing for thousands of years, and it's right next door to Azerbaijan, which only became a country in 1918. And Stalin, to destabilize the region, knew that the Muslim Azeris and the Christian Armenians, would would have conflicts. So he gave our land, Artsakh, which that's the Armenian name, and the other name is Nagorno-Karabakh. He gave it to Azerbaijan to destabilize the area. And this was terrible because Armenians in Artsakh, their human rights were being violated all the time. And what happened is for instance, one of my grandmothers is from Nakhichevan, and they had that cemetery in Julfa with over 10,000 khachkars, beautiful carved tuff stones. And in 2005, the Azeri government, they started taking sledgehammers and knocking the khachkars down. And just last week I went to the indigenous seminar, and they're talking about UNESCO, which is formed to help preserve cultural monuments. And the indigenous people are always talking about preserving their cultural monuments. And this was our monument. But so when the Armenians protested to UNESCO, guess who was on the board of UNESCO? Azerbaijan got elected for 4 years to the board of UNESCO, which is supposed to punish people for destroying cultural monuments, but they were the criminals, and so they did nothing about this. And in fact, they bulldozed. There were Armenians in Iran, which is right across the border, and they could see this, and they bulldozed our ancient cemetery, and now it's a military firing range. So that's one half of my family, and now Nakhichevan is being depopulated. It was depopulated of Armenians, and it now has Azeris. And then, I'm in the community board member of my health clinic in Brooklyn. And what they do is they have these legislative luncheons to attract the politicians to help raise money for the clinic. And the borough president of Brooklyn, Eric Adams, he got $7,500 to go to Turkey and promote Turkish tourism, and one of the cities he went to was Gaziantep. And Aintab is where my grandmother's family was killed, and they herded all these Armenians into a church and burned them alive, and they had cut off the hands of so many Armenian children you could pave the roads with them. And then he also adopted a sister city, Uskadar, which used to be Skadadi, which Armenians were killed in that sister city. And in the website it says, oh, this is wonderful to have a sister city in Turkey to promote educational and cultural opportunities for Brooklyn youth. So here I am I was like, how can we get the truth out to all these kids? How can we get the truth out to the Brooklyn president? And then not only that, Obama, he denies the genocide. I gave up a day to go and vote for him, and he lied to Armenians saying that he would, and he actually went to Turkey, Istanbul, on an anti-terrorism conference when the Turks are incredible terrorists. And so the Turks have spent like $200 million on denialist propaganda. While I was at WBAI on April 24th doing my show, outside the window was Turkish skywriting of these false websites in which they turn all the lies around. It's just incredible what incredible false information they concoct. And I guess and the problem is it's so easy to tell a lie, and it's so hard to overcome it. And I have actually, most of my life has been trying to overcome Turkish lies, and it's been very hard because they have so much money, and they have our taxpayers' money, and it's very hard. So when I finally got to Armenia and I met Monte, and he said, come, and videotape this war, and I hadn't heard of the war. I'd never heard of Artsakh, Nagorno-Karabakh. And right now, actually, the war has started again. In April, Aliyev, who's the corrupt dictator of Azerbaijan, who actually is supported by none other than Hillary Clinton, which is really scary for me because what are the choices of leaders in America? And she's so sneaky and behind. She gets donations from Azeris and Turks, and she's and people think that she's something else, but. See how just even mention of her lies, the sign on here, give me this sign. This is, I have to always carry these signs around so that people remember the Armenian Genocide, because Hillary Clinton is certainly not going to bring justice, and they talk about a democracy, but it's not happening in American politics. So just recently, Israel sold Azerbaijan $1.6 billion worth of drones and anti-tank missiles. Russia sold Azeris $6 billion. And one of the reasons all this is going on is because of the BTC oil pipeline. And Baku, which is the capital of Azerbaijan, has a lot of oil, and America loves oil, and they love Turkish NATO bases, and so Armenia is now considered to be an ally of Russia, and so we're on the downside. They're not supporting us, but for Armenians, the indigenous people who, when I went to this war, it was like 1991 I got there, in every family in Artsakh, someone had died, sacrificing their lives to liberate this land from Azeri control. And one of the things about Armenia is, Mount Ararat is Armenian land, and Mount Ararat is the sacred symbol of Armenia. And if you go to the capital of Armenia, you can see it from all the windows, but it's under Turkish control. And we put this on everything in our symbols, our paintings, our everything. And the Turks said, well, what are you doing taking our mountain and putting it in your thing? And then someone said to them, well, what are you doing taking the moon and putting it somewhere? So they're very denying about everything. And so the problem is that right now in Brooklyn also, this weekend is Mental Health Week in 1,000 Brooklyn churches. They're talking about mental health. But why don't they talk about genocide denial and the effect on your mental health? And why are all these churches not concerned that Armenia, which is one of the first Christian nations, and a lot of times people were given a choice, convert to Islam or be killed, or nailed to crosses, or burned in churches, and the fat of the people burned would roll out the sidewalk, and priests beheaded. Why aren't these 1,000 churches in Brooklyn concerned with that effect? And if Armenians, the part of the problem is that Armenian churches don't do solidarity to those churches to say, hey, try and support us. So in my life, it has been spent resisting assimilation, because I grew up knowing nothing about my culture. At Berkeley, I was involved in Black cultural studies, Chicano cultural studies, and I didn't even know that, I had an own freedom struggle. So I began to do a lot of research. This is a photo of what Armenian women, some used to wear, and those clothes are no longer available. It's hard to even find an Armenian dress, that embroidered and that stuff. And these pictures of the genocide, these were taken by a German photographer, and it was at the risk of their lives that they're getting these things out. And these, I try and put up in different places because nobody knows about this. One of the outreaches I do is trying to compare the Armenian freedom struggle to the Palestinian freedom struggle, because you hear about Palestine. If you're in the leftist community in New York City, Palestine is mentioned day and night, but Armenia never gets on the radar. And we have a similar struggle. Both of our homelands are occupied. The United States government, the taxpayers give foreign aid to both Israel and Turkey, and people need to be aware of these similarities. And the Turks just really, oh my God, they hold demonstrations in which they call Armenians liars. And they are, it's like incredible, because Americans know nothing about this. So when they see these signs, and this was in Times Square, and they actually had a gigantic billboard thing, which must have cost $10,000, and they're giving out these T-shirts, Turkey yes, Armenia no, to Americans, and food and stuff. And these Americans getting into their subconscious, they don't know anything about this. And so it's very ironic. This year when I took these photographs, I had gone to this reading at Barnes & Noble's, and the Turks are famous for getting after anyone who's talking about the genocide. So this woman was reading from her book, A Knock at the Door, in which her grandmother was raped by a Turk, and 5 Turks stood up in the Barnes & Noble's and said, these are lies. But fortunately, at that time, the district attorney Morgenthau was there too, and so he took them away. But it's this constant that this is a fake. So all of the genocide survivors that I interviewed had to die being called liars and not acknowledged by their government that they pay taxes to. So when Monte told me, come with me, there's a war going on in Artsakh, I said, okay. It's a very beautiful land. Very mountainous, a lot of beautiful lakes and mountains. And I'd never seen a war. I went to Berkeley, where being a soldier was, not too cool. And so he didn't tell me that they didn't want women in his place. And it was a struggle, because when I got there, they said, okay, you go in this car and we'll go in the truck with all the soldiers. But the car broke down and we had to push it. And this woman was walking by, and I took her photo, and it became a very famous photo as like the light of Artsakh, because her face was so radiant, even though there was all these wars. But then the other women, like this woman, her son was killed by an Azeri, and that was her life, and all these pictures of stress, of people trying in Armenia, in Artsakh, they're like mainly farmers. They grow mulberry, pomegranates, apricots. They like to grow things in the earth, and their animals. And so the idea that they couldn't live in peace because some conqueror wanted to come and kill them just created a lot of trauma. And I had never seen a war, and I have to say, I just felt a big responsibility to give up my life and document this and join the armed forces. And also, I just felt like these people that were dead, I didn't want them to die in silence. I wanted the world to know about them. And so the women, I mainly focused on the women who, were sacrificing everything for their families and living in very sick conditions. And I took these photos to Amnesty International and Helsinki Human Rights, and they said, well, this is just an ethnic conflict on both sides. And that's in the current situation with Azerbaijan attacking Artsakh. That's how the New York Times and all these other papers describe it, an ethnic conflict on both sides. And I told Amnesty International, this is not an ethnic conflict on both sides. We're the indigenous people that have lived there for centuries. They're coming to attack us and grab our land and do everything. And you're really, it's a lie to call it an ethnic conflict. And you know what Amnesty International told me? They said, we don't take into account history. And I said, how can you write this phony report without history? So I spent a lot of time, 8 years of my life in the war zone as a freedom fighter, but I also tried to, reach out to the children, and I made this sign in English and Armenian to help their school, and then the school was blown up and the sign was destroyed, and I, met a lot of mine victims. The whole land in Artsakh is filled with mines. Other women soldiers, like this is Arvig, who was, when the war started, when Azerbaijan, they're trying to get independence, she made an Armenian flag and she was immediately arrested, and then she made 14 others and was arrested again. And this is Marguerite Sarkissian, who was a sniper. And I was so proud to be at her side. And recently Armenians had a demonstration about Artsakh in front of the UN, and they had our heroes, and they didn't have a single woman soldier. And I am a war veteran. I said I wanted to speak, and this other guy was there. They wouldn't even let us speak as war veterans. I don't get any honor from my Armenian community. But these were the times, like this is how we got supplies, But because we knew about the genocide, and because this was an opportunity to be victorious, when the genocide, people were skinned alive and chopped up and all that stuff, this was our time to be victorious. And the Azeris, they didn't really want to be there. So I wrote a lot about women's soldiers. If anyone wants to invite me to their school to talk about women soldiers in Artsakh, I'll be happy to come. And also there's a lot of, Armenian youth that are really trying to get the word out. But we need help. We need all leftist organizations to include Armenia in their poems, in their theater, in their conferences, in their books. I want to hear the word. I go to everything and I never hear Armenia. And so that's why I do a lot of this. Also, there's this question of intergenerational trauma, because I know that it's very hard when you have all these corporations supporting Turkey, and nothing really supports Armenia. Like, even when there was a protest against Hillary Clinton by the Bernie Sanders people and her association with dictators, I called them up and I said, why don't you put her association with President of Azerbaijan, Aliyev, and how corrupt he is? And they never added it to their list. And so it's like a thing that they don't want to touch because it's too much trouble. And so emotionally, you feel left out, you feel alienated, you feel mislabeled, you feel just the indifference to your situation, the distortion of your reality. And so this intergenerational trauma is something that I have to deal with. So I'm going to a trauma group, and also I have to deal with post-traumatic stress of being a war veteran in a community that doesn't value me as a war veteran. So you can reach me at Anoush, ANOUSH, 949 @gmail.com, and I'll be happy to speak more about this. Thank you.